Hello, lovely people. So I'm reading from Meditations on the Tarot, a journey into Christian Hermeticism. I'm skipping to letter 4, the Emperor, because this letter deals with authority, and I find it rather amusing in this strange Kafkaesque style world that we live in, where most people seem to have willingly given away their very real authority to other people who lie to them over and over again, or to IT systems which have no heart or discernment or discretion and naturally place the system over and above the welfare of the individual human being. I find this all rather bizarre. It's almost like you're being made to forget that you have a very real right to be here. You owe nobody anything, and this is a beautiful, creative and created world. This letter is a very powerful letter. I hope you enjoy it. I suggest that you listen to it or buy the book and read it over and over again and meditate on it. I hope you enjoy. I'll begin. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's from Luke 35. Dear unknown friend, the less superficial a person is, and the more he knows and is capable of, the greater is his authority. To be something, to know something, and to be capable of something is what endows a person with authority. One can also say that a person has authority in proportion to what he unites within himself of the profundity of mysticism, the direct wisdom of gnosis, and the productive power of magic. Whosoever has this to a certain degree can found a school. Whosoever has this to a still higher degree can lay down the law. It's authority alone which is the true and unique power of law. Compulsion is only an expedient to which one takes recourse in order to remedy a lack of authority. Where there is authority, i.e., where there is the breath of sacred magic filled by the rays of light of gnosis, emanated from the profound fire of mysticism, there compulsion is superfluous. Now the Emperor of the fourth arcanum of the tarot doesn't have a sword or any other weapon. He rules by means of the sceptre and by the sceptre alone. This is why the first idea that the card naturally evokes is that of the authority underlying law. The thesis which proceeds from meditation on the three preceding arcana is that all authority has its source in the ineffable divine name, the Yod, the He, the Vav and the He. I'll call that Jehovah now for ease of reading. And that all law derives from this name. The implication here is that the bearer of true authority doesn't replace divine authority. On the contrary, he cedes his place to it. He has to renounce something to this end. The card teaches us in the first instance that the Emperor has renounced compulsion and violence. He has no weapons. His right hand holds the sceptre forward on which his gaze is fixed, and his left hand holds his tightly fastened belt. He is neither standing nor sitting. He is simply leaning back against a lowered throne and has one foot placed on the ground. His legs are crossed. The shield, adorned with an eagle, rests on the ground at his side, and lastly he is wearing a large and heavy crown. The context of the card expresses active renunciation rather than the renunciation of constraint alone. The Emperor has renounced ease, being not seated. He has renounced walking, being in a leaning position and having his legs crossed. He may neither advance in order to take the offensive, nor move back in order to retreat. His station is by his seat and his coat of arms. He is on sentry duty, and as such he doesn't have the freedom of movement. He is a guardian bound to his post. What he guards is fundamentally the sceptre. Now, the sceptre is not an implement with which one is empowered to do something or other. It is, from a practical point of view, a symbol serving nothing. The Emperor has therefore renounced all action, having pledged his right hand to the sceptre that he holds before him, whereas his left hand holds his fastened belt. It is no longer free because the emperor restrains himself with it. He serves the function of holding the impulsive and instinctive nature of the emperor in check so that it doesn't intervene and divert him from his post as guardian. The emperor has therefore renounced movement by means of his legs and action by means of his arms. At the same time, he wears a large and heavy crown, and we've already meditated on the meaning of the crown with regard to that of the empress, which is in the chapter previously, which has a double meaning. It's a sign of legitimacy on the one hand, but it's also the sign of a task or mission by which the crown is charged from above. Thus, every crown is essentially a crown of thorns. Not only is it heavy, but also it calls for a painful restraint with regard to the thought and free or arbitrary imagination of the personality. It certainly emits rays outwards, but these same rays become thorns for the personality within. They play the role of nails, piercing and crucifying each thought or image of the personal imagination. Here, true thought receives confirmation and subsequent illumination. False or irrelevant thought is riveted and reduced to impotence. The crown of the emperor signifies the renunciation of freedom and intellectual movement, just as his arms and legs signify his renunciation of freedom of action and movement. He is deprived of the three so-called natural liberties of the human being, those of opinion, word and movement. Authority demands this. But this is not all. The shield bearing an eagle rests on the ground at his side. The emperor doesn't hold it with his hand as the empress does. The shield is certainly there, but it belongs rather to the throne than to the person of the emperor. This means to say that the purpose for which the emperor is on sentry duty is not his, but that of the throne. The emperor doesn't have a personal mission. He's renounced this in favour of the throne. Or, in esoteric terms, he has no name. He's anonymous, because the name, the mission, belongs to the throne. He's not there in his own name, but rather in the name of a throne. This is the fourth renunciation of the emperor, the renunciation of a personal mission or a name, in the esoteric meaning of the word. It's said that nature has a horror of emptiness. The spiritual counter-truth here is that the spirit has a horror of fullness. It's necessary to create a natural emptiness, and this is what renunciation achieves in order for the spiritual to manifest itself. The Beatitudes of the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew, state this fundamental truth. The first Beatitude, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," means to say that those who are rich in spirit, who are filled with the spiritual kingdom of man, have no room for the kingdom of heaven. Revelation presupposes emptiness, space put at its disposal in order to manifest itself. This is why it's necessary to renounce personal opinion in order to receive the revelation of the truth, personal action in order to become an agent for sacred magic, the way of personal development in order to be guided by the Master of Ways, and one's personally chosen mission in order to be charged with a mission from above. The emperor has established in himself this fourfold emptiness. This is why he is emperor, and this is why he is authority. He's made a place in himself for the divine name Jehovah, which is the source of authority. He's renounced personal intellectual initiative, and the emptiness which results is filled by divine initiative, or the Yod of the sacred name. He's renounced action and movement, and the void which results is filled by revelationary action and magical movement from above, i.e. the He, and Vau of the divine name. Finally, he has renounced his personal mission, he has become anonymous, and the emptiness which results is filled with authority, the second He of the divine name, i.e. he becomes a source of law and order. Lao Tzu reveals the arcanum of authority in his Tao Te Ching. He says, 30 spokes unite in one nave, and because of the part where nothing exists, we have the use of a carriage wheel. Clay is moulded into vessels. and because of the space where nothing exists, we're able to use them as vessels. Doors and windows are cut out in the walls of a house, and because they are empty spaces, we're able to use them. Therefore, on the one hand, we have the benefit of existence, and on the other, we make use of non-existence. Be humble, and you will remain entire. Be bent, and you will remain straight. Be vacant, and you will remain full. Be worn, and you will remain new. He who has little will receive. He who has much will be embarrassed. Therefore the sage keeps to one and becomes the standard for the world. He doesn't display himself, therefore he shines. He doesn't approve himself, therefore he's noted. He doesn't praise himself, therefore he has merit. He doesn't glory in himself, and therefore he excels. And because he doesn't compete, therefore no one in the world can compete with him. Because he has authority. God governs the world by authority and not by force. If this was so, there would be neither freedom nor law in the world, and the first 3 petitions of the Lord's Prayer would lose all meaning. He who prays these petitions does so solely with the purpose of affirming and increasing divine authority and not divine power. The God who is almighty, not virtually but actually, has no need at all to be petitioned that his reign may come and that his will may be done. The meaning of this prayer is that God is powerful only insofar as his authority is freely recognised and accepted. Prayer is the act of such recognition and acceptance. One is free to be believing or unbelieving. Nothing and no one can compel us to have faith. No scientific discovery, no logical argument, no physical torture can force us to believe, i.e. to freely recognise and accept the authority of God. But on the other hand, once this authority is recognised and accepted, the powerless become powerful. Then divine power can manifest itself, and this is why it's said that a grain of faith is sufficient to move mountains. Now the problem of authority is at the same time of mystical, Gnostic, magical and Hermetic significance. It comprises the Christian mystery of crucifixion and the mystery of withdrawal of the Lurianic Kabbalah. Here are some considerations which can help us arrive at a most profound meditation upon this mystery. The Christian world worships the crucifix, i.e. the image expressing the paradox of Almighty God reduced to a state of extreme powerlessness. And it's in this paradox that one sees the highest revelation of the divine in the whole history of mankind. One sees there the most perfect revelation of the God of love. The Christian creed says, "For our sake he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He suffered death and was buried." The only Son of the Eternal Father nailed to the cross for our sake, this is what is divinely impressed upon all souls, including the robber crucified to the right. This impression is unforgettable and inexpressible. It's the immediate breath of God which has inspired and still inspires thousands of martyrs, confessors of the faith, virgins and recluses. But it's not so that every human being, finding himself facing the crucifix, may be thus divinely moved. There are those who react in the opposite way, and it was so at the time of Calvary, and it is so today. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." That's from Matthew. The chief sacrificers with the scribes and elders also mocked him, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. If he is the King of Israel, let him come down now from the cross, and we'll believe in him. He trusts in God, let God deliver him now, if he loves him." That's also from Matthew. This is the other reaction, and nowadays we encounter exactly the same. For example, in Soviet radio broadcasts from Moscow, the argument from Moscow is always the same. If God exists, he must know that we, the communists, dethrone him. Why does he not give a visible sign, if not of his power, at least of his existence? Why doesn't he defend his own interests? This is, in other words, the old argument, "Come down from the cross and we'll believe you." I cite these well-known things because they reveal a certain dogma underlying them, and it's a dogma or philosophical principle which states that truth and power are identical. That which is powerful is true, and that which is powerless is false. According to this dogma or philosophical principle, which has become that of modern technological science, power is the absolute criterion and supreme ideal of truth. Only that which is powerful is of the divine. Now there are open and secret worshippers of the idol of power, for it is an idol and the source of all idolatry. Also in Christian factions or in religious and spiritual circles in general. I'm not speaking about Christian or spiritually minded princes or politicians who covet power, but rather about the adherents to doctrines advancing the primacy of power. Here are the two categories: those who aspire to the ideal of the Superman and those who believe in a God that is actually almighty and therefore responsible for all that happens. Amongst esotericists, occultists and magicians, there are many, be it openly or secretly, who aspire to the ideal of the Superman. In the meantime, they often pose as masters or high priests worthy of the acclaim of the future Superman. They are at the same time singularly in agreement in that they raise God far, very far, to the heights of absolute abstraction, so that he doesn't discomfort them by his too concrete presence. And in order that they have room for themselves to be able to develop their own greatness without the rival grandeur of the divine to discomfort them. They build their individual towers of Babel, which fall, as a rule, according to the law of all towers of Babel, and experience sooner or later a salutary fall, as in the teaching of the 16th card of the tarot. They do not fall from a real height into a real abyss. It's only from an imaginary height that they fall, and they only fall to the ground. They learn the lesson that we human beings of today have all learned or have still to learn. The worship of the idol of power, conceived of as a Superman, above all when one identifies oneself with it, is relatively inoffensive, being fundamentally infantile. But this is not so with the other category of power worshippers, namely those who project this ideal onto God himself. Their faith in God depends only on the power of God. If God was powerless, they wouldn't believe in him. It's they who teach that God has created souls predestined to eternal damnation and others predestined to salvation. It's they who make God responsible for the entire history of the human race, including all its atrocities. God, they say, chastises his disobedient children by means of wars, revolutions, tyrannies, and other similar things. How could it be otherwise? God is almighty, therefore all that happens is only able to happen through his action or with his consent. The idol of power has such a hold on some human minds that they prefer a God who is a mixture of good and evil, provided that he is powerful, to a God of love who governs only by the intrinsic authority of the divine, by truth, beauty and goodness. I.e., they prefer a God who is actually almighty to the crucified God. However, the father in the parable of the prodigal son had neither sent his son far from his paternal home in order to lead a life of debauchery, nor had he prevented him from leaving and forced him to lead a life which was pleasing to him. All he did was to await his return and to go and meet him when the son was approaching his father's house. Everything which took place in the story of the prodigal son, save for his return to the father, was clearly contrary to the will of the father. Now, the history of the human race since the fall is that of the prodigal son. It's not a matter of the law of involution and evolution according to the divine plan of modern theosophists, but rather of an abuse of freedom similar to that of the prodigal son. And the key formula of the history of humanity is to be found neither in the progress of civilization, nor in the process of evolution, or in any other process, but rather in the parable of the prodigal son, in the words, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." That's from Luke. Is mankind therefore solely responsible for its history? Without a doubt, because it's not God who has willed it to be as such. God is crucified in it. One understands this when one takes account of the significance of the fact of human freedom, and likewise the freedom of the beings of the spiritual hierarchies, the angels, archangels, principalities, powers, virtues, dominions, thrones, cherubim, and seraphim. All these beings, including man, have an existence that is either real or illusionary. If they have a real existence, if they are not a mirage, they are independent entities endowed not only with a phenomenal independence, but also a noumenal independence. Now, noumenal independence is what we understand by freedom. Freedom, in fact, is nothing other than the real and complete existence of a being created by God. To be free and to exist are synonymous from a moral and spiritual point of view. Just as morality would not exist without freedom, so would an unfree spiritual entity, soul or spirit, not exist for itself, but would be part of another spiritual entity which is free, i.e. which really exists. Freedom is the spiritual existence of beings. When we read in the scripture that God created all beings, the essential meaning here is that God has given freedom or existence to all beings. Freedom, once having been given, God does not take back. This is why the beings of the 10 hierarchies mentioned above are immortal. Death, not separation from the body, but real death, would be the absolute deprivation of liberty, complete destruction of the existence given by God. But who or what can take the divine gift of freedom, the divine gift of existence, from a being? Freedom, existence is inalienable, and the beings of the 10 hierarchies are immortal. The statement freedom or existence is inalienable can be understood as the highest gift, the very greatest value imaginable. Then this would be a foretaste of paradise. Or as condemnation to perpetual existence, then this would be a foretaste of hell. Because no one sends us anywhere, freedom not being a theatre, it is we ourselves who make the choice. Love existence and you've chosen heaven. Hate it and there you've chosen hell. Now God is, with respect to free beings, either the ruling king, in the sense of authority such as that taught by the 4th arcanum of the tarot, or the crucified. He is king with regard to those of his beings who voluntarily accept his authority. He is crucified with respect to those beings who abuse their freedom and worship idols. He replaced divine authority by a substitute. King and crucified at one and the same time. This is the mystery of Pilate's inscription on the cross of Calvary. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Almighty and powerless both at once. This is why miracles of healing in human history were able to be accomplished by saints, whilst bloody wars and disasters raged around them. Freedom is the true throne of God, and in his cross at the same time, freedom is the key to comprehension of the role of God in history, to comprehension of the God of love and the God King, without the sacrilege of making him a tyrant, and without the blasphemy of doubting his power or of doubting his very existence. God is all-powerful in history, inasmuch as there is faith, and he is crucified insofar as one turns away from him. I'll read that sentence again. God is all-powerful in history, inasmuch as there is faith, and he is crucified insofar as one turns away from him. Thus, divine crucifixion follows from the fact of freedom, or the fact of the real existence of the beings of the 10 hierarchies, when it's a matter of a world governed by divine authority and not by compulsion. Let us turn now to the idea of Tzimtzum, the withdrawal of God, of the Lurianic school of Kabbalah. The doctrine of Tzimtzum reveals one of the 3 mysteries in the Kabbalah: the mystery of union, the mystery of concentration or divine withdrawal, the mystery of reincarnation or the revolution of souls. The 2 other mysteries, the mystery of union and the mystery of the revolution of souls, will be treated later in other letters. Concerning the mystery of the divine withdrawal, or concentration, which interests us here, it's a question of the thesis that the existence of the universe is rendered possible by the act of contraction of God within himself. God made a place for the world in abandoning a region interior to himself. The first act of Ein Sof, the infinite being, is therefore not a step outside but a step inside, a movement of recoil, of falling back upon oneself, of withdrawing into oneself. Instead of emanation, we have the opposite, contraction. The first act of the all is not an act of revelation, but one of limitation. Only in the second act does God send out a ray of his light and begin his revelation, or rather his unfolding as God the Creator, in the primordial space of his own creation. More than that, every new act of emanation and manifestation is preceded by one of concentration and retraction. That's from Gershom G. Scholem, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. In other words, in order to create the world ex nihilo, which is out of nothing, God had first to bring the void into existence. He had to withdraw within in order to create a mystical space, a space without his presence, the void. And it's in thinking this thought that we assist at the birth of freedom. For as Berdyaev has formulated it, freedom is not determined by God, it's part of the nothing out of which God created the world. The void, the mystical space from which God withdrew himself through his act of Tzimtzum, is the place of origin of freedom, i.e. the place of the origin of an existence, which is absolute potentiality, not in any way determined. And all of the beings of the 10 created hierarchies are the children of God and freedom, born of divine plenitude and the void. They carry within themselves a drop of the void and a spark of God. Their existence, their freedom, is the void within them. Their essence, their spark of love, is the divine blood within them. They are immortal because the void is indestructible, and the monad proceeding from God is also indestructible. Further, these two indestructible elements, the meonic element, the void, and the pleromic element, plenitude, are indissolubly bound to one another. The idea of Tzimtzum, the withdrawal of God in order to create freedom, and that of divine crucifixion on account of freedom, are in complete accordance. For the withdrawal of God in order to make a space for freedom and his renunciation of the use of his power against the abuse of freedom, within determined limits, are only two aspects of the same idea. It goes without saying that the idea of Tzimtzum and that of divine crucifixion is inapplicable when God is conceived of in the sense of pantheism. Pantheism, like materialism, doesn't admit the real existence of individual beings. Therefore, the fact of freedom, not merely apparent freedom, is excluded. For pantheism and for materialism, there is no question and cannot be of a divine withdrawal or a divine crucifixion. On the other hand, the Kabbalistic doctrine of Tzimtzum is the only serious explanation that I know of concerning a creation out of nothing, which is of a kind to act as a counterbalance to pure and simple pantheism. And moreover, it constitutes a deep link between the Old and New Testament in bringing to light the cosmic significance of the idea of sacrifice. Now, the reflection of the idea of divine withdrawal and divine crucifixion is found to be indicated, as we've seen, in the fourth arcanum of the tarot, the Emperor. The Emperor reigns by pure authority. He reigns over free beings, i.e. not by means of the sword, but by means of the sceptre. The sceptre itself bears a globe with a cross above. The sceptre, therefore, expresses in as clear as possible a manner the central idea of the arcanum. Just as the world, the globe, is ruled by the cross, so is the power of the Emperor over the terrestrial globe, subject to the sign of the cross. The power of the Emperor reflects divine power. And just as the latter is affected by divine contraction and by voluntary divine powerlessness, So the power of the emperor is affected by the contraction of his personal forces, the belt drawn tight by the emperor, and by voluntary immobility, the crossed legs of the emperor. At his post, the seat or throne of the emperor. The post of the emperor, what an abundance of ideas concerning the post, its historical mission, its functions in the light of natural right, and its role in the light of divine right, of the Emperor of Christendom are to be found amongst medieval authors. As it's suitable that the institution of a city or a kingdom be made according to the model of the institution of the world, similarly it is necessary to draw from divine government the order or ratio of the government of a city. This is a fundamental thesis advanced on this subject by St. Thomas Aquinas. This is why authors of the Middle Ages couldn't imagine Christianity without an emperor, just as they couldn't imagine the universal church without a pope. Because if the world is governed hierarchically, Christianity, or the Sanctum Imperium, cannot be otherwise. Hierarchy is a pyramid which exists only when it is complete, and it is the emperor who is at its summit. Then come the kings, dukes, noblemen, citizens and peasants. But it's the crown of the emperor which confers royalty to the royal crowns, from which the ducal crowns and all other crowns in turn derive their authority. The post of the emperor is nevertheless not only that of the last, or rather the first, instance of sole legitimacy, it was also magical. If we understand by magic the action of correspondences between that which is below and that which is above. It was the principle itself of authority from which all lesser authorities derived not only their legitimacy, but also their hold over the consciousness of the people. This is why royal crowns, one after another, lost their lustre and were eclipsed after the imperial crown was eclipsed. Maybe clown, I don't know. Monarchies are unable to exist for long without the monarchy. Kings cannot apportion the crown and sceptre of the emperor among themselves and pose as emperors in their particular countries, because the shadow of the emperor is always present. And if in the past it was the emperor who gave lustre to the royal crowns, it was later the shadow of the absent emperor which obscured the royal crowns and consequently all other crowns, those of dukes and princes, counts, etc. A pyramid is not complete without its summit. Hierarchy does not exist when it's not complete. Without an emperor, there will be sooner or later no more kings, and when there are no kings, there will be sooner or later no more nobility. When there is no more nobility, there will be sooner or later no more bourgeoisie or peasants. This is how one arrives at the dictatorship of the proletariat, the class hostile to the hierarchical principle, which latter, however, is the reflection of divine order. This is why the proletariat professes atheism. Europe is haunted by the shadow of the emperor. One senses his absence just as vividly as in former times one sensed his presence. Because the emptiness of the wound speaks, and that which we miss knows how to make us sense it. Napoleon, eyewitness to the French Revolution, understood the direction which Europe had taken, the direction towards the complete destruction of hierarchy, and he sensed the shadow of the emperor. He knew what had to be restored in Europe, which was not the royal throne of France, because kings cannot exist for long without the emperor, but rather the imperial throne of Europe. So he decided to fill the gap himself. He made himself emperor, and he made his brothers kings, but it was to the sword that he took recourse, instead of ruling by the sceptre, the globe bearing the cross. He made the decision to rule by the sword, but all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. That's in Matthew. Hitler also had the delirium of desire to occupy the empty place of emperor. He believed he could establish the 1,000-year empire of tyranny by means of the sword, but again all those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. No, the post of the emperor does not belong any longer either to those who desire it or to the choice of the people. It's reserved to the choice of heaven alone. It has become a cult. And the crown, the sceptre, the throne, the coat of arms of the emperor are to be found in the catacombs. In the catacombs. This means to say under absolute protection. Now the emperor, on the fourth card, is alone, without a court or retinue. His throne is in no way to be found in a room of the imperial palace, but rather in the open, in an uncultivated field, not located in a town. A meagre clump of grass by his foot is there as the whole imperial court, as all the witnesses of his imperial splendour. But the clear sky is spread above him. He is a silhouette on the background of the sky. Alone in the presence of the sky, this is how the emperor is. One could ask, why is the astonishing fact that the emperor is found with his throne in the open air, under the starry sky? If you wish. Overlooked by so many authors of the tarot. Why have they not stated the fact that the emperor is alone, without a court or retinue? I believe that it's because it's rarely that one lets the symbol, the image of the symbol as such, say all that it has to say through its unique context. One lets it say a little, and one is suddenly more interested in one's own thoughts, i.e. what one has to say oneself, rather than what the symbol has to say. Yet the card is specific. The emperor is alone in open air in an uncultivated field with a tuft of grass as his only company, save for the sky and the earth. The card teaches us the arcanum of the authority of the emperor, although it may be unrecognised, occult, unknown and unappreciated. It's a matter of the crown, the sceptre, the throne and the coat of arms being guarded without any witnesses other than the sky and the earth, by a solitary man leaning against the throne, with his legs crossed, wearing a crown, holding the sceptre and clasping his belt. It's authority as such, and it's the post of authority as such, which is expressed here. Authority is the magic of spiritual profundity filled with wisdom. Or, in other words, it's the result of magic based on gnosis due to mystical experience. Authority is the second hay of the divine name, Jehovah, but it's not the second hay taken separately. It's only when the whole divine name manifests itself. For this reason, it's more correct to say that authority is the completely manifested divine name. The completely manifested divine name signifies at the same time a post, the post of emperor, or the state of consciousness of the complete synthesis of mysticism, gnosis and sacred magic. And it is this state of consciousness of complete synthesis which is initiation. Initiation understood not in the sense of ritual, not in the sense of the possession of information held to be secret, but rather in the sense of the state of consciousness where eternity and the present moment are one. It's a simultaneous vision of the temporal and the eternal, of that which is below and that which is above. This formula of initiation always remains the same. It's the Latin version of the Emerald Tablet. This unity actualized, contemplated, practiced and understood is initiation, or the sanctification of the divine name in man, which is the deeper meaning of the first petition of the Pater Noster, Sanctificatur nomen tuum. The emperor signifies the authority of initiation or of the initiate. It's due to complete divine names from the Kabbalistic point of view, to the magical great arcanum from the point of view of magic, and to the philosopher's stone from the standpoint of alchemy. It is, in other words, the unity and synthesis of mysticism, gnosis and magic. This unity or synthesis we've designated in the second letter as Hermetic philosophy. And it's bound up with Hermetic philosophy It's bound up with the Hermetic philosophical sense. In this Hermetic philosophy, it is necessary to repeat, does not signify a philosophy derived or disengaged from the organism of the unity of mysticism, gnosis, and sacred magic. It is this very unity in manifestation. Hermetic philosophy is as inseparable from the unity, mysticism, gnosis, magic, as is the second A from the divine name. It is authority or the manifestation of the unity, mysticism, gnosis, magic. Hermetic philosophy corresponds to the stage of most true, in that which is true without falsehood and certain, in the epistemological formula of the Emerald Tablet. For it is this which is the summary of all mystical experience, Gnostic revelation, and practical magic. It is spontaneous mystical experience which becomes true or reflected in consciousness, gnosis, and then becomes certain. Although its magical realization, and which is then reflected a second time, the second A or the second gnosis of the divine name, in the domain of pure thought based on pure experience, where it's examined and finally summarized, and thus becomes most true. The formula therefore states that the principle of epistemology or nosology of Hermetic philosophy with its triple touchstone. This principle can be formulated in several ways. Here's one. That which is absolutely subjective, pure mystical experience, must objectifies itself in consciousness and be accepted there as true, Gnostic revelation. Then proved to be certain by its objective fruits, sacred magic. And lastly, proved to be absolutely true in the light of pure thought, based on pure subjective and objective experience, Hermetic philosophy. It is a matter, therefore, of the four different senses, the mystical sense or spiritual touch, the Gnostic sense or spiritual hearing, the magical sense or spiritual vision, and lastly the Hermetic philosophical sense or sense of spiritual comprehension. This triple touchstone of Hermetic philosophy is therefore the intrinsic value of a revelation, its constructive fruitfulness, and its concordance with earlier revelations, with the laws of thought, and with all available experience. In Hermetic philosophy, something is absolutely true, therefore, only when it is of divine origin, and bears fruit in conformity with its origin, and is in accordance with categorical exigencies of thought and experience. The Hermeticist is therefore a person who is at one and the same time a mystic, a Gnostic, a magician, a realist idealistic philosopher. He is a realist idealist philosopher because he relies as much on experience as on speculative thought, as much on facts as on ideas, because facts and ideas are for him only two aspects of the same reality, i.e. the same truth. Hermetic philosophy, being the summary and synthesis of mysticism, gnosis, and sacred magic, is not a philosophy among other philosophies, or a particular philosophical system amongst other particular philosophical systems. Just as the Catholic Church, being Catholic or universal, can't consider itself as a particular church among other particular churches, nor consider its dogmas as religious opinions among other religious opinions or confessions. So Hermetic philosophy, being the synthesis of all that which is essential in the spiritual life of humanity, can't consider itself as a philosophy amongst many others. Presumption? It would be, without any doubt, a monstrous presumption if it were a matter of human invention instead of revelation from above. In fact, if you have a truth revealed from above, if the acceptance of this truth brings miracles of healing, peace, and vivification with it, and if lastly it explains to you 1,000 unexplained things that are inexplicable without it, can you then consider it as an opinion among other opinions? Dogmatism? Yes, if one understands by dogma the certainty due to revelation of divine worth, which prove fruitful and constructive, and due to the confirmation that they receive from reason and experience together. When one has certainty based on the concordance of divine revelation, divine human operation and human understanding, how can one act as if one didn't have it? Is it truly necessary to deny 3 times before the cock crows in order to be accepted into the good company of free spirits and non-dogmatics, and to be chauffeured along with them by the fire of things relating to human creation? Is that heresy? Yes, if by heresy one understands the primacy of universal revelation, of good works, universally recognised as such, and of the ideal of universality amongst philosophies. Hermetic philosophy is not a particular philosophy amongst particular existing philosophies. It's not so already for the sole reason that it doesn't operate with univocal concepts and their verbal definitions, as do philosophies, but rather with arcana and their symbolic expressions. Compare the Emerald Tablet with the Critique of Pure Reason by Kant, and you will see the difference. The Emerald Tablet states the fundamental arcana of mystical, gnostic, magical, philosophical work. The Critique of Pure Reason elaborates an edifice composed of univocal concepts, such as the categories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality, which altogether portray the transcendental method of Kant, the method of thinking about the act of thought, or reflection about reflection. This method, however, is an aspect of the 18th arcanum of the tarot, the moon, and we'll see this. And this arcanum, expressed by the symbol of the card, the moon, teaches in the Hermetic way the essence of what Kant taught in the philosophical way about the transcendental method. So is Hermetic philosophy and only symbolism pure and simple, and has it nothing to do with the methods of philosophical and scientific reasoning? Yes and no. Yes, insofar as Hermetic philosophy is of an esoteric nature, i.e. it consists of arcana orientated towards the mystery and expressed in symbols. No, insofar as it exercises a stimulating effect on the philosophical and scientific reasoning of its adherents. It is wrapped, so to say, in a philosophical and scientific intellectual penumbra, which is due to the activity of its adherents pursuing the aim of translating, insofar as it's possible to do so, the arcana and the symbols of Hermetic philosophy into univocal concepts and verbal definitions. It's a process of crystallization, because the translation of multivocal concepts or arcana into univocal concepts is comparable to the transition from the state of organic life to the mineral state. It's thus that the occult sciences such as the Kabbalah, astrology and alchemy are derived from Hermetic philosophy. These sciences are able to have their own secrets, but the arcana which are reflected in them belong to the domain of Hermetic philosophy. Insofar as the intellectualization of Hermetic philosophy is of the nature of commentary and corollary, it is legitimate and even indispensable. For then one will translate each arcanum into many univocal concepts, 3 for example, and by this very fact one will help the intellect to habituate itself to think hermetically, i.e. in multivocal concepts or arcana. But when the intellectualization of Hermetic philosophy pursues the aim of creating an autonomous system of univocal concepts without formal contradiction between them, it commits an abuse. For instead of helping human reason to raise itself above itself, it would set up a greater obstacle for it, and it would captivate it instead of freeing it. The occult sciences are therefore derived from Hermetic philosophy by way of intellectualization. This is why one should not consider symbols, the major arcana of the tarot for example, as allegorical expressions of theories or concepts of these sciences, for it's the opposite which is true. It's the doctrines of the occult sciences which are derived from the symbols of the tarot or other symbols, and it's they which are to be considered as intellectually allegorical expressions of the symbols and arcana of Hermetic esotericism. Thus it would not do to say the 4th card, the Emperor, is a symbol of the astrological doctrine concerning Jupiter. One would rather say the arcanum of the 4th card, the Emperor, is also revealed in the astrological doctrine concerning Jupiter. The correspondence as such remains intact, but there is a world of difference between these 2 statements, because in the case of the first, one remains an astrologer and nothing but an astrologer, whilst in the case of the second, one is thinking as a hermeticist, although remaining an astrologer if one is one. Hermetic philosophy is not composed of the Kabbalah, astrology, magic and alchemy. These four branches sprouting from the trunk do not make the trunk, but rather they live in or from the trunk. The trunk is the manifested unity of mysticism, gnosis and magic. There are no theories, there is only experience, including here the intellectual experience of arcana and symbols. Mystical experience is the root, the Gnostic experience of revelation is its sap, and the experience of practical or sacred magic is its wood. For this reason, its teaching, or the body of its tradition, consists of spiritual exercises, and all its arcana, including the arcana of the tarot, are practical spiritual exercises, whose aim is to awaken from sleep ever deeper layers of consciousness. Necessary commentaries and corollaries accompany this practice and constitute the bark of the trunk. Thus, the key to the Apocalypse of St. John is nowhere to be found, for it's not at all a matter of interpreting it with a view to extracting a philosophical, metaphysical, or historical system. The key to the Apocalypse is to practice it, i.e. to make use of it as a book of spiritual exercises which awaken from the sleep ever deeper layers of consciousness. The 7 letters to the churches, the 7 seals of the sealed book, the 7 trumpets and the 7 vials signify altogether a course of spiritual exercises composed of 28 exercises. For as the Apocalypse is a revelation put into writing, it's necessary in order to understand it, to establish in oneself a state of consciousness which is suited to receive revelations. It's a state of concentration without effort, taught by the first arcanum, the magician, followed by a vigilant inner silence, taught by the second arcanum, the high priestess, which becomes an inspired activity of imagination and thought, where the consciousness self acts together with superconsciousness, which is the teaching of the third arcanum, which is the Empress. And lastly, the conscious self halts its creative activity and contemplates in letting pass in review everything which preceded, with a view to summarizing it, which is the practical teaching of the fourth arcanum, the Emperor. The mastery of these 4 psychurgical operations symbolized by the magician, the high priestess, the Empress and the Emperor is the key to the Apocalypse. One will search in vain for another. The Gospels, likewise, are spiritual exercises, i.e. one that is not only to read and to reread them, but also to plunge entirely into their element, to breathe their air, to participate as an eyewitness, as it were, in the events described there, and all this not in a scrutinizing way, but as an admirer, with ever-growing admiration. The Old Testament also contains parts which are spiritual exercises. The Jewish Kabbalists, the author or authors of the Zohar, for example, made such use of it, and it's thus that the Kabbalah originated and that it lives. The difference between Kabbalists and the other faithful depends only on the fact that the former drew spiritual exercises from the scripture, whilst the latter studied it and believed it. The aim of spiritual exercises is depth. It's necessary to become deep in order to be able to attain experience and knowledge of profound things, and its symbolism, which is the language of depth. Thus, arcana, expressed by symbols, are both the means and the aim of spiritual exercises, of which the living tradition of Hermetic philosophy is composed. Spiritual exercises in common form the common link that unites Hermeticists. It's not knowledge in common which unites them, but rather the spiritual exercises and the experience which goes hand in hand with them. If 3 people from different countries were to meet each other, having made the book of Genesis by Moses, the Gospel of St. John, and the vision of Ezekiel, the subject of spiritual exercises for many years, they would do so in brotherhood. Although one would know the history of humanity, the other would have the science of healing, and the third would make a profound Kabbalist. That which one knows is the result of personal experience and orientation, whilst depth, the niveau, the level to which one attains, disregarding the aspect and extent of knowledge that one has gained, is what one has in common. Hermeticism, the Hermetic tradition, is in the first place and above all a certain degree of depth, a certain level of consciousness, and it is the practice of spiritual exercise which safeguards this. And with respect to the knowledge of individual Hermeticists, and this is applicable to initiates also, it depends upon the individual vocation of each one of them. The task that one pursues determines the nature and extent not only of knowledge, but also of the personal experience upon which this knowledge is based. One has the experience and gains knowledge of that which is necessary for the accomplishment of the task, which proceeds from one's individual vocation. In other words, one knows that which is necessary in order to be informed and to be able to orientate oneself in the domain relevant to one's individual vocation. Thus, a Hermeticist whose vocation is healing would know all about things, relationships between the consciousness, the system of the lotus flowers or chakras, the nervous system, and the system of the endocrine glands, that another Hermeticist, whose vocation is the spiritual history of humanity, would not know. But this latter, in his turn, would know things ignored by the healer, facts of the past and the present concerning relationships between the spiritual hierarchies and humanity, between that which took place or is taking place above and that which took place or is taking place below. But this knowing, insofar as it's not a matter of arcana, consists of facts, though often of a purely spiritual nature and not theories. Thus, for example, reincarnation is in no way a theory which one has to believe or not believe. In Hermeticism, no one would dream of putting forward a case in order to persuade or even to dissuade people of the truth of the reincarnationist theory. For the Hermeticist, it's a fact which is either known through experience or ignored. Just as one does not make propaganda for or against the fact that we sleep at night and wake up anew each morning, for this is a matter of experience, so is the fact that we die and are born anew a matter of experience. I.e., either one has certainty about it or else one doesn't. But those who are certain should know that ignorance of reincarnation often has a very profound and even sublime reasons associated with the vocation of the person in question. When, for example, a person has a vocation which demands a maximum of concentration in the present, he may renounce all spiritual memories of the past, because the awakened memory is not always beneficial, is often a burden. It's so, above all, when it's a matter of a vocation which demands an attitude entirely free of all prejudice, as is the case with the vocations of priest, doctor, and judge. The priest, doctor, and judge have to concentrate themselves in such a way on the tasks of the present that they must not be distracted by memories of former existences. One can perform miracles without the memory of former lives, as was the case with the Holy Vicar of Ars, and one can also perform miracles wholly in possession of this memory, as was the case with Monsieur Philip of Lyon. For reincarnation is neither a dogma, i.e. a truth necessary for salvation, nor a heresy, contrary to a truth necessary for salvation. It's simply a fact of experience, just as sleep and heredity are, and as such it's natural. Everything depends on its interpretation, and one can interpret it in such a manner as to make it a hymn to the glory of God, and one can interpret it in such a way as to make it a blasphemy. When one says to forgive is to grant the opportunity to begin again, God forgives more than 70 times 7 times, always granting us opportunities anew. What infinite goodness of God! Here is an interpretation of the glory of God. But when one says there is a mechanism of infinite evolution and one is morally determined by previous lives, there is no grace, there is only the law of cause and effect, then this is a blasphemous interpretation. It reduces God to the function of the engineer of a moral machine. Reincarnation is in no way an exception in what is liable to a double interpretation. In fact, every pertinent fact is liable to it. Thus, for example, heredity can be interpreted in the sense of complete determinism. therefore excluding freedom and also morality. Or rather, it can be interpreted as a possibility for gradual improvement of the organism in order to render it a more perfect instrument to vocations for posterity. Didn't Abraham receive the promise that the Messiah would come in his lineage? And wasn't this the same promise given to David? Nevertheless, whatever the personal interpretation of a fact may be, a fact remains a fact, and it's necessary to know it when one wants to orientate oneself in the domain to which it belongs. Thus, Hermeticists have knowledge of diverse facts according to their personal vocations, but Hermetic philosophy is nevertheless not the sum total of knowledge acquired by individuals. It's an organism of arcana expressed in symbols, which are at the same time both spiritual exercises and their resulting aptitudes. An arcanum practiced as a spiritual exercise for a sufficient length of time becomes an aptitude. It does not give the pupil knowledge of new facts, but makes him suited to acquire such knowledge when he has need of it. Initiation is the capacity of orientating oneself in every domain and acquiring their knowledge of relevant facts, the key facts. The initiate is one who knows how to attain knowledge, i.e., who knows how to ask, seek, and put into practice the appropriate means in order to succeed. Spiritual exercises alone have taught him. No theory or doctrine, however luminous, may in any way have rendered him capable of knowing how to know. Spiritual exercises have taught him practical sense, and in Hermetic philosophy there is no other sense than the practical, and the infallible effectiveness of the arcanum of the three united endeavours, which is the basis of every spiritual exercise and every arcanum. Namely, ask and it will be given you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be opened to you. That's taken from Luke. Thus, Hermetic philosophy doesn't teach what one ought to believe concerning God, man and nature, but it teaches rather how to ask, seek and knock in order to arrive at mystical experience, Gnostic illumination and the magical effect of that which one seeks to know about God, man and nature. And it's after having asked, sought and knocked, and after one's received, found and gained access, that one knows. This kind of knowing, the certainty of the synthetic comprehension of mystical experience, Gnostic revelation and magical effect, is the Emperor. This is the practical teaching of the fourth card of the Tarot. It's a matter here of the development and use of the fourth spiritual sense, i.e. the Hermetic philosophical sense, following the development and usage of the mystical, Gnostic and magical senses. The attitude for knowing how to know is the characteristic trait essential to this sense. We have defined it above, second letter, as a sense of synthesis. Now we're able to advance and to do so in a much more profound way in defining it as the initiate sense, or the sense of orientation and acquisition of knowledge of essential facts in every domain. So how does this sense function? There's reason to indicate in the first instance that it's not identical with what one customarily designates as metaphysical sense, since the metaphysical sense of metaphysicians is the taste and capacity for living in abstract theories, the liking for the abstract, whilst the Hermetic philosophical sense is, on the contrary, due to the orientation towards the concrete, spiritual, psychic and physical. While the metaphysical sense operates with the concept of God, the Hermetic philosophical sense is oriented towards the living God, the spiritual concrete fact of God. The Christian celestial Father and the Ancient of Days of the Kabbalists is not an abstract concept, it's not a notion, but rather a being. The metaphysical sense works in such a manner as to deduce by way of abstraction the laws of facts and the principles of laws. The Hermetic philosophical sense, in contrast, perceives through the facts the entities of the spiritual hierarchies, and through them the living God. For the initiate sense, the space between the supreme principle and the domain of facts is not peopled with laws and principles, but rather with living spiritual beings, each endowed with a manner, look, voice, way of speaking, and a name. For the initiate sense, the Archangel Michael is not a law or principle. He is a living being whose face is invisible because it's given place to the face of God. Thus, this is why he has the name Michael. He who, Mai, is as Ka, God, El. No one could endure the vision of the face of Michael because he is as God. He is like unto God. The Hermetic philosophical sense, or initiate sense, is that of concrete spiritual realities. The Hermeticist explains facts not by laws obtained by abstraction, nor much less still by principles obtained by active abstraction, but rather by proceeding from abstract facts to more concrete beings in order to arrive at that which is most concrete. That alone in existence which is absolutely concrete, i.e. God. Because for the initiate sense, God is that which is most real and therefore most concrete. In fact, almost amongst all that exists, God is that alone which is absolutely real and concrete, whilst created beings are only relatively real and concrete. And what we designate as concrete fact is in reality only an abstraction from divine reality. This doesn't mean to say that Hermeticists are incapable of abstraction and that they necessarily neglect laws and principles. They are human beings and therefore also possess the metaphysical sense. In possessing this, he makes use of it like everyone, but what makes him a Hermeticist, in the sense of the Emperor of the Tarot, is the Hermetic philosophical sense. He is as much a Hermeticist as he is endowed with the Hermetic philosophical sense and makes use of it, whilst the metaphysical sense alone would never make a Hermeticist in the proper sense of the word. Is this not the tragedy of René Guénon, who, being gifted with a developed metaphysical sense and yet lacking the Hermetic philosophical sense, sought always and everywhere the concrete spiritual? And finally, tired of the world of abstractions, he hoped to find liberation from intellectualism by plunging himself into the element of fervour of the Muslim masses at prayer in a Cairo mosque. The last hope of a soul thirsty for mystical experience and languishing in the captivity of the intellect. If so, may divine mercy grant him what he sought so much. There is room to remark here that the last orientation of René Guénon, i.e. towards the faith of the simpler people adhering to a more simple religion, is not without reason. For the Hermetic philosophical sense has more in common with the plain and sincere faith of simple people than abstract metaphysics has. For the common believer, God lives. Likewise for the Hermeticists. The believer addresses himself to saints and angels. For the Hermeticist, they're real. The believer believes in miracles. The Hermeticist lives in the presence of miracles. The believer prays for the living and the dead. The Hermeticist dedicates all his efforts in the domain of sacred magic to the good of the living and the dead. The believer esteems all that which is traditional. The Hermeticist does likewise. What more is there to say? Perhaps the Emperor owes his authority not to his power, visible or invisible, over human beings, but rather because he represents them before God. He has authority not because he's superhuman, but rather because he is very human, because he represents all that is human. King David was more human than all men of his time, and this is why he was anointed by divine order by the prophet Samuel. And for this reason the Eternal gave him the solemn promise that his throne would be established forever. The throne, the post of the representative of humanity, will therefore never perish. And it's this which is the post of the Emperor. It's this which is true authority. Hermetic philosophy also has a human ideal to which it aspires. Its spiritual exercises, its arcana, follow the practical aim of realizing the man of authority, the Father Man. This is the man who is more human than all others, the man worthy of the throne of David. The human ideal of practical Hermeticism is not the Superman of Nietzsche, not the Superman of India plunged in contemplation of eternity, not the Superman Hierophant of Gurdjieff, not the Superman philosopher of the Stoic and Vedanta philosophies. No, its human ideal is a man who is human to such a degree that he contains and bears in himself all that which is human, that he may be the guardian of the throne of David. And the divine? How is it here in that which concerns the manifestation of the divine? Practical Hermeticism is alchemy. The ideal of Hermeticism is essentially and fundamentally the alchemical ideal. This means to say, the more one becomes truly human, the more one manifests the divine element underlying human nature, which is the image and likeness of God. That's from Genesis. I'm going to read that again. This means to say, the more one becomes truly human, the more one manifests the divine element underlying human nature, which is the image and likeness of God. The ideal of abstraction invites human beings to do away with human nature, to dehumanize. In contrast, the ideal of alchemical transformation of Hermeticism offers to human beings the way to the realization of the true human nature, which is the image and likeness of God. Hermeticism is the rehumanization of all elements of human nature. It is their return to their true essence. Just as all base metal can be transformed into silver and gold, so are all the forces of human nature susceptible to transformation into silver or gold, i.e. into what they are when they share in the image and likeness of God. But in order to re-become what they are in their essence, they must be submitted to the operation of sublimation. Now this operation is crucifying for that which is base amongst them, and at the same time is the blossoming of that which is their true essence. The cross on the rose cross, is a symbol of this operation of the realization of the truly human man. Thus the Emperor of the Tarot renounces the four arbitrary liberties of human nature. He is in this sense crucified, and as the real symbol of the emptiness which is established because of the renunciation is the wound, one could say that the Emperor is he who has 4 wounds. It's by these 4 wounds that the manifestation of the divine image and likeness of human nature is accomplished in him. The divine in human nature, and what of the divine which transcends it? In order for the latter to manifest, it's necessary to have 1 wound more. It's necessary to have 5 wounds. Now it's the following card, the Pope, which will teach us the arcanum of the manifestation of the divine transcending human nature by means of the 5 wounds. The last section of that chapter, I think, is particularly powerful. So that concludes the chapter of the Emperor on Meditations of the Tarot. I hope you enjoyed that. I will see you for the next letter.